Okay, the two different Napoleons in France. All right. Now, this is important, right? Because when we talk about Bonapartism, people get all confused, right? So, France, you have the French Revolution, right? Out of the French Revolution, you have the National Assembly, you have the Committee on Public Safety, you have two political factions, the Jacobins and the Girondists, you have the Reign of Terror, you have a lot of revolutionary factions killing each other, and you have a lot of chaos. Amid that chaos, you have Napoleon Bonaparte, who is a general in the French military. He's actually from an island. He's from Corsica, I believe, right? And he marches into power and declares himself basically the military dictator. And that is the end of the chaos that follows the French Revolution, right? Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, you know, in a lot of ways, he's a brutal dictator, but in a lot of ways, he's also kind of a progressive, right? Napoleon Bonaparte, he calls himself the revolution in boots, meaning that he incarnates all the values of the French Revolution, but also meaning that he's marching the revolution across Europe, right? And that's what happens. Napoleon starts trying to seize territory, and in all the places Napoleon goes, he breaks apart feudalism. He introduces capitalist reforms. Napoleon, he introduces the concept of meritocracy into his army. So no more are people's ranks based on their hereditary, right? You don't become a general because your dad was a general. You become a general because they think you're good enough to be a general. Meritocracy, right? Napoleon also makes a deal with the Pope to bring back the Catholic Church, right? Because you have to remember the French Revolution was atheist, right? People don't realize this, but during the French Revolution, the Jacobins were atheists, right? They did not believe in God. And this makes sense because the Catholic Church had been the institution propping up feudalism in France. So they destroy all the churches, they convert the churches to temples of reason, you know, they execute a number of priests. They don't believe in the church anymore. Well, Napoleon, you know, he comes back in and he starts making compromises with the old system. France doesn't go back to feudalism, it stays capitalist. But there are some tactical retreats, right? And one of them is that the Catholic Church, the feudal religious institution, is restored. So the Catholic Church is brought back, and Napoleon decides, you know what, he's going to be the emperor of France. And he has this coronation ceremony where everyone's lined up to see the Pope put the crown on Napoleon's head. So the ceremony takes place, and the Pope is all ready to put the crown on Napoleon's head, and Napoleon grabs the crown out of the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head and says, F you, Pope. And he's then excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and Napoleon, but Catholicism is the state religion in France. It's a pretty wild incident. That's Napoleon Bonaparte, right? And of course, he's fighting all across Europe. He's battling against the British. The British are his main enemy. He's marching across Europe. Europe is kind of united against him. He makes the stupid mistake of invading Russia. Not a smart move because the Russian people, you know, despite the fact that maybe they were frustrated with the Tsarist autocracy, they were not going to be taken over by France. There's the 1812 overture. I don't know if you've heard it. Beautiful piece of music by Tchaikovsky that celebrates Napoleon getting his ass handed to him by the Russians. There's the novel War and Peace by Tolstoy, which is a very, very long, complex study of the Russian people and how they related to the invasion by Napoleon. It talks about how some of the peasants were so mad at the Tsar and feudalism that they supported Napoleon, but other people, even though they thought Napoleon was more progressive, they still were loyal to their homeland. It's a beautiful novel. I've never read it. It's very, very long, but it's considered one of the key works of Russian literature. Napoleon gets his ass handed to him by the Russians and then by the British at the Battle of Waterloo. He's, exiled, and then he comes back for 100 days, and then he goes back, and that's the end of that. That's the first Napoleon, right? Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte is a great example of what they call thermidor, right? Because after the French Revolution, they decided 12 months in a year wasn't scientific enough, so they invented the French Revolutionary calendar, which has 10 months, right? And the month where Napoleon came to power, or the month where something happened, it wasn't Napoleon coming to power, it was like some people got executed, there is the Thermidor. It's the turning point in the revolution where the new order solidifies itself. Well, Napoleon was the Thermidor right? That the French Revolution, first the king is toppled, and then you had chaos, right? You had the Reign of Terror, you had all these executions and the excesses and the revenge. But then Napoleon comes in and stabilizes the new order, and he makes compromises with the old system, right? He brings back feudalism. He declares himself emperor, but no, he doesn't bring back feudalism. I'm sorry. He declares himself emperor. He brings back the Catholic Church, but he keeps capitalism intact, right? Property relations stay the same, but there are retreats and compromises with the old order, right? People compare that with what happened with Stalin, right? That the Russian Revolution, the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, you have the Russian Civil War and chaos and death and Trotskyites and permanent revolution and all this chaos. Well, Stalin comes in and he brings back the Russian Orthodox Church and he outlaws abortion and gay marriage and he sets up a one-party state and he puts Lenin in the mausoleum and he declares the ideology of the party to be Marxism-Leninism, and like Napoleon, solidified French capitalism from the chaos of the French Revolution. Banking before the Fed, Stalin came in and solidified socialism in Russia by making some strategic compromises with the old system. Banking before the Fed. All right. And that's, you can make that parallel. But the Thermidor, right, is the moment in the revolution where the chaos ends and the new order solidifies itself and makes some compromises with the old order, right? That the French people, sure, the Jacobins and all of them had been ultra-revolutionary, but your average French peasant was religious. So Napoleon figures, okay, we got to bring the church back, right? The French Revolution, they were trying to be ultra-democratic and all of that, but you know what? There was a lot of chaos. Napoleon declares himself the emperor, right? That's Napoleon. And that's Thermidor, which is an important concept in Marxism, right? Because every revolution goes through these stages, right? Of the upheaval and the what's it called? The terror, right? Usually there's vengeance against the old order, and then you have the Thermidor where the revolution solidifies itself, right? This happened in the Iranian Revolution. This happened in the Cuban Revolution, right? That revolutions go through these kinds of stages. You have the chaos, you have the terror, you have the Thermidor. There's actually a very good book called The Anatomy of a Revolution that actually studies this in great detail. It was published in the 1930s, and it talks about how every revolution goes through these phases. You can read it. Right, the Thermidor is not counter-revolution, says Mary London. It's consolidation, exactly, right? The new order is intact, but it consolidates and it makes some compromises with the old system to end the chaos. Stalin was the Thermidor of the Russian Revolution, right? Napoleon was the Thermidor of the French Revolution. That was the first Napoleon, okay? So speed ahead, 1851, right? It's long after Napoleon is gone. Napoleon's nephew is a politician in France. Napoleon, his name is Louis Bonaparte, or Louis Napoleon, right? And he's a politician in France. France is in a political crisis. There are strikes going on all the time. People are out protesting and demanding their rights. There's labor unions. There's a revolutionary movement. Karl Marx is living in France and writing agitational pamphlets. There's a crisis of overproduction in capitalism, right? Underconsumption, overproduction, right? All the problems they're having there. There's revolts going on among the workers. There's the French farmers that are unhappy. There's all these problems. There's all these poor people. It's a crisis in French society. So, right? France is very proud of the French Revolution, of their revolutionary tradition. And there's this guy who's the nephew of Napoleon, who was this very important leader, right? There's a feeling among the ruling class and among the military that they ought to have some kind of strong order to come in and stabilize the country. So within the military, a faction forms called the Party of Order. And Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, is the guy they pick to be their guy. And they carry out a coup d'etat. The military overthrows the elected government, and they make Louis Bonaparte the military dictator. He's like the president, but it's like not democratic. The military has overthrown the government. And Louis Bonaparte, representing one faction of the ruling class, the bankers, the financiers, enacts a lot of very dramatic reforms to try and stabilize French society. Right? The farmers love Louis Bonaparte. The financiers love Louis Bonaparte. The factory owners, however, do not like Louis Bonaparte. Right? And, a lot of the socialists don't like him either, right? The workers' unions and stuff. Louis Bonaparte comes in, And to stabilize society, he's brutal. He executes and puts down a lot of socialist protesters, but he enacts a lot of dramatic reforms. He builds big railroads to help stimulate the economy of France. He sets up free hospitals. So poor people, if you're poor and you need health care, you can go to this free hospital that they set up in Paris and other places, right? He forces factory owners to like, I think it was like a 12-hour workday, and he is a Bonapartist, right? And this is where the Marxist concept of Bonapartism comes in, right? From the first Napoleon, we get the concept of the Thermidor. From Napoleon III or Louis Bonaparte, we get the concept of Bonapartism. Because was Napoleon III, Louis Bonaparte, a revolutionary? No. Did he represent socialism? No. He represented one section of the ruling class, the party of order, trying to stabilize a capitalist crisis. And this is what happens in a crisis, is the factions in the ruling class fight against each other, and they all want the crisis to end, right? They want the economy to get good again. They want all the protests and rebellions among the people to end. However, they don't want to pay for it. They want another section of the ruling class to pay for it. So they struggle to take control of the government and use the government to make the other capitalists pay for it. And in France, the banker capitalists and the farmer capitalists seized control of the government with Napoleon III and forced the factory owners to pay for it, to pay for stabilizing the crisis, right? They had their taxes go up to pay for the railroads. They had to let their workers only work 12 hours a day. They taxed them to set up hospitals, right? That Napoleon Bonaparte was a Bonapartist. Napoleon III, Louis Bonaparte, was a Bonapartist for one section of the French capitalist class, standing above society, trying to create order, right? And that was Bonapartism. And that fascism is a form of Bonapartism. Social democracy can become a form of Bonapartism. Hitler was a Bonapartist in Germany. Roosevelt was a Bonapartist in the United States. Donald Trump is trying his hardest to be a Bonapartist, but failing, right? He represents one section of the ruling class trying to take control of the government and use it to stabilize the economy, but he's failing, right? And this is a phenomenon called Bonapartism, where one section of the ruling class puts itself above all society and tries to use state power to stabilize the economy. And sometimes Bonapartism is progressive, right? Some of what Napoleon III did was progressive. Free hospitals for poor people, labor reforms, that's progressive. Killing socialists, not so progressive, right? Roosevelt, I would say, is a very progressive Bonapartist, right? I mean, he aligned with the Communist Party, he supported the labor movement, he enacted all kinds of progressive economic reforms. Hitler, on the other hand, is a very reactionary form of Bonapartism, right? He's, trying to stabilize the economy by putting half the country in prison camps and the other half in military uniforms and, and slave labor and military spending and, But, again, both of them are Bonapartists, meaning that they're trying to stabilize a capitalist economy by using the government, by one section of the ruling class seizing control of the government to try and force the rest of the capitalist economy to be stable, right? And one section of the ruling class ruling over other sections of the ruling class in the hopes of stabilizing the economy. So those are the two Napoleons, right? I just told you about the first Napoleon, came out of the French Revolution. I just told you about the second Napoleon, from whom we get the concept of Bonapartism. Karl Marx wrote a very good pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Now you know about the two Napoleons.